How do we as humans experience spaces and the environment that we live in? To answer this question, let us picture a place. And in this place, we have two people. Let's call them Frank and Susan. They both are experiencing the space around them. However, they seem to not enjoy it the same way. Why are they feeling differently? To understand the reason behind it, let's look at how they actually experience it in the first place. We use our senses to experience our environment. These are our view, sensory touch, smelling, tasting, and finally hearing. Some people might be limited in their senses. A blind person, for instance, will compensate his lack of eyesight by hearing and his touch. Therefore, he will experience the space around him differently. However, in our case, Frank and Susan both are not limited in any of their senses, so the difference in their attitude has to have another reason. Let's have a look at an object they are observing. An object's appearance is affected by different aspects. For one, the surface of the object. It can be altered by changing its shape or changing its dimensions, but you could also change the overall complexity of the surface. As we can see, changing the surface's properties can have an effect on our attitude towards it. Another aspect of an object is its material. Part of the material is the texture and the way light is absorbed or reflected. Another part is the color of the material. But there are also many other aspects that can be sensed by us, for example, the smell. So, different aspects of the object's surface or material have an impact on our attitude towards it. However, in the environment or spaces around us is not just one object, but there are many different ones. And all these objects form a contextual connection to each other and also to us. To understand how this connection influences us, let's see what the architect intended for his design. In the beginning of the design process, the architect first makes assumptions about what the environment should convey and how it should function. So he might think about who actually used the place and what criteria the environment has to fulfill. He does this based on his experience, education, and also his personal opinions. After he has set certain goals, he needs to think about how to achieve them. For this, he can use certain design principles like less is more, form follows function, or maybe the golden ratio. There are many different design principles. Another example are the Gestalt design principles. They describe how we might be influenced by certain patterns or shapes, or how we group elements together, or what significance we give one object over another. Let's have a look at some of the ways he can utilize some of these design principles. A basic parameter in the environment is the distance between objects. Depending on how narrow or wide a walkway is, we might have a different emotional response while walking through it. Proximity is a principle that derives from the parameter distance. It describes how we group objects that are closer to each other than objects with a greater distance. The architect has to balance functional aspects, how the space performs and is used, with aesthetical aspects that influence our perception and our attitude. We want to have an environment that works for our needs and purposes, but it should also look nice and feel good. So now we know how the elements in our environment correlate to each other. We know that we group certain objects and we might ignore others that are not inside our field of view, or they seem to be of lesser interest. But all these observations were done from a fixed point of view, so the effect of the elements might work as we're standing still. However, we as humans rarely just stand still. We move around to experience our environment. And as we change our relations to the elements in our environment, we also change their effect on us. We might group other objects and might not be able to see the relation between objects that we saw before. We might also get a broader view of the composition of a space, and therefore our attitude towards that environment might change. Movement is a factor that is not very often accounted for in architectural designs, as we usually review our designs from a plan view or a rendering and not experience them with the aspect of movement in mind. But after all, Frank and Susan still don't share the same opinion. So, our attitudes toward the environment has to come from a person's individuality. But how do we quantify the opinions of people then? To do this, we could look at different groups of people that have the same educational background. These could be architects, pre-architects, and laymen. As these different groups experience their environment, they get a questionnaire. The questionnaire is made of adjective pairs that generally describe a particular quality of a place. This is also called a semantic differential. The participants can rate the pairs from 1 to 7 by points ranging from one side to the other, meaning if it is on the very end of one side, that adjective is considered to be perceived as very strong. This graph in itself shows the average opinion in a quantitative way. By now comparing the average opinions of different user groups, we can see that there is a difference between them, meaning that the educational background is one factor that influences our perception and attitude towards spaces and our environment. But the education is not the only factor that makes us an individual. Our individuality also comes from our personality. Are we introverted or extroverted? Our experiences, how we were raised, or our education. Another factor that influences us is our motivation to act or do something. What is our purpose, needs and desires, our aspirations, and also recent inspirations? But cultural factors also influence us. Politics, the society we live in, cultural aspects, social groups, or religions. To understand how these influences in our social and personal background change our perception and attitude, let's have a look at Frank and Susan again. We as humans don't just see objects and elements as a composition. We give objects a symbolic meaning. This symbolic meaning actually creates our attitude towards the object and therefore the environment. And these symbolic meanings are influenced by our individual background. The objects can remain the same, but it will mean different things to another person. Susan is relating the shape of the object to a religious symbol. She has a positive attitude towards that religion and therefore also a positive attitude towards the object. Frank, on the other hand, has a different attitude towards this religion. His symbolic meaning is different and so is his opinion. Symbolic meaning can be created by different factors. Here, Susan remembers that her favorite architect has designed and lived in this place. His involvement in the past with the environment might change her opinion towards it. Frank, who simply doesn't know this fact, cannot have the same symbolic meaning of the environment. Humans also don't just relate to objects, but also to other humans around them. Depending on their personality, one might like a crowd of people and another really dislikes it. Finally, our motivations and usage of a space has a direct effect on our attitude in comparison to other people. Frank really needs to find a bathroom. He has certain needs, and these are a major influence in his current attitude. Susan, on the other hand, is looking for a book, which you can find easily. We can see that there are now many factors that make up the perception of our environment. We have looked at the aspect of change through our movement, but we haven't considered the time itself as an aspect of change. Our environment and our individual background might change over time. So the places we have disliked before might get accepted, and vice versa. Let's discuss different reasons for that change. Let's look at our ability to adapt. When we react to a certain stimulation in the environment, let's say noise for example, we have a reaction and an attitude towards our environment. We might not like living next to a highway, but with time we might adapt to the sound, and in the end we might not even care about it. However, to some stimulations from our environment we cannot adapt because the reaction that we have to it is too strong. Our environment changing and us actually realizing that change also can affect us. We might find the city we live in a little crowded, but it's not too bad. But as more buildings are constructed, we feel worse about it. Minor changes in comparison to the original estate might not get noticed. Larger changes, however, are easier to notice and result in stronger opinions towards that change. We have already discussed that we are influenced by our individual background. For instance, we might share certain values and beliefs of a social group. But these values are also subjective to change. This can be compared to a fashion in certain seasons. Maybe this year orange is accepted to be the best color, but next year that trend is over and a different color is chosen. The values have changed, and with these values our attitude towards objects that represent them have as well. For the architect, these are a lot of points to be considered. Let's quickly summarize what he has to keep in mind. He has to think about each object, its form and material. He has to know the humans that would use the place and their general background and attitudes towards certain objects and their symbolic meaning. He has to consider how the elements in his environment work together, but also consider the movement of the user through his environment. And finally, he thinks about how his environment will change in the future and how it performs then. Now, this sounds like an impossible task for somebody to do. Although pleasing everybody might be an impossible task, spaces and environments exist that we find pleasing and that continue to do so for centuries. Maybe a start could be to think about designs like this guy.
I want you to feel challenged, interrogated, tired. I want you to feel like I hate you personally. Because I do.